about to leave, already packing. Come with me, I'm not really asking. We'll get away to a place where we don't know. About to see the world in action, what we can be, life with no distractions. We'll get away, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free with me. Let's go, let's be free with me. Be free. Not looking back, eyes on the freeway, Bonnie and Clyde, a classic cliche. We're on the run, this is what we waited for. Take my hand, we'll make it somehow. We can't miss out. I'm done living life with the lights out. Die with my own doubts. Be free.
Hello, good evening, and welcome to our latest politics live stream. Love to see lots of you joining us this evening for some live revision. I think you can probably see my dog wandering about in the background. I do apologise. From a very wild and wet Yorkshire. How's it with you, Ciara? Is it pretty wet down there as well?
Pretty wet, not quite wild,
No.
but non-stop rain the last 2 days, which is always fun.
Okay, so we are looking at UK government tonight, so component 2 stuff minus the non-core ideas. And we've got lots of activities to get through, so we'll get cracking very quickly. If you haven't joined us before, you can join in with the activities using the live chat window. Sometimes it'll just be A, B, C or D. Other times we might ask you for a longer answer. If you've got any questions for us, we'll keep an eye on the chat window as well, and try and respond to anything that you do come up with. So without further ado, let's get on with it. So over to Ciara for a 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, okay, so you're going to have 90 seconds to provide some answers to this question. So it's about actually asking for examples. So we know that obviously knowledge is good and key terms and analysis, but also having up-to-date examples as well. So can you provide, and type in the chat, 3 examples of constitutional reforms even, that happened between 1997 and 2010? So this is the Labour government's reforms. So can you give me 3 of those? Can you give me 2 constitutional reforms since 2015? So that's the Conservative governments. And can you give me 1 case for further reform? So reforming the UK constitution is a not finished project. So maybe what's at least 1 example of something that can be done to improve the UK's democracy in the UK?
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Who's going to be brave and be the first to put something in?
Someone put something down.
Oh, yeah.
Good one. Another good one. Further reform. A lot to pick from for Labour's reform. Excellent.
Oh, right. Time's up.
Yeah, I like that. Mahir put something quite specific. They said further reform and talked about like representation. That's a good democratic criterion. Of course, for paper two, there's a lot of links to component one. So the synoptic links is how you get your top marks. And yeah, representation is a democratic principle. And I think we could link that to the next answer, which talks about House of Lords reform. So yes, there is a kind of a democratic issue with the UK in the sense that we have poor representation. Could that be improved? Through the reforming of the House of Lords. So, for example, we have less hereditary peers, but maybe no hereditary peers could be more representative.
Or it could, of course, and another nice synoptic link, some future constitutional reform could be changing the voting system, changing to proportional representation, or electoral reform of some description, which would be a nice synoptic link with component one. And I don't know whether House of Lords reform was down there as future reform or an example for the first one, 3 constitutional reforms between 97 and 2010, because of course we did have House of Lords reform then, didn't we?
Yeah, Blair radically reformed the House of Lords, actually. So yeah, that could go for either. So is it that it's an unfinished project and that there's still more to go on that, or is it, done and dusted? Does there need to be an elected chamber? All these are quite big debates within the constitution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So constitutional reforms 97 to 2010 is kind of listed as a specific bit on the spec, isn't it? That time. I know for the most part we
Yeah.
say always use up-to-date examples are the most up-to-date examples that you've got. But you could be asked specifically about constitutional reform from that time because it is on the spec. So we've had House of Lords reform, but there's quite a lot from that time. Devolution, of course, we've had as well.
Devolution.
Yeah, there was lots of devolution at that time. So a good time for constitutional reform. There were quite a few. Should we see what you put up?
Yeah. So put, for example, the 3, I put the Human Rights Act of 1998. So it's quite a big seminal moment for constitutional reform. The Freedom of Information Act, which caused a lot of problems actually for Tony Blair. He found this one particularly frustrating. This is the one that he called himself a nincompoop for doing. And then the Constitutional Reform Act of 2005, and that was like another massive piece of reform in basically creating the Supreme Court. So really quite significant reforms that came through Labour. So like Duncan said, these are historic, but they are part of the specification. And these are the examples that you would use if you wanted to make the case for perhaps why we don't need a codified constitution, because our constitution is flexible and adaptive and has become more democratic as a result. So you could potentially use these in that sense.
And yeah, and lots of others, as we've already had, House of Lords reform, devolution, um, uh, and not just one devolution, greater use of referendums, all the referendums for the devolutions. Lots there, really.
Mm.
It was a time of significant constitutional reform. And Constitutional Reform Act, of course, absolutely enormous, as well as creating the
Mm.
Supreme Court. It divided up the Home Office into being the Home Office and the Ministry for Justice. So it
Yeah.
created that new department, which is very significant. Um, Changed the role of the kind of the Lord Chancellor, this which had previously been this sort of very significant kind of
News. Yeah. Yeah.
role. Yeah, so a
Because
huge
he
amount
existed
went on.
in three bodies, right? So
Mm,
he had a complete fusion of power. So that separation is quite important. He was in cabinet, he was in parliament, and he was also part of the judiciary. So
yeah,
really quite an important piece of reform, I think.
yeah, lots of ways. Yeah, okay. Um, some of them, like the Freedom of Information Act, the minister responsible for that wanted to go much further with that than what actually ultimately came out. So sometimes some of the reforms were less sort of radical than perhaps some people would have liked. House of Lords
Mm,
reform, you could say the same about. In the end, it was a sort of a compromise that occurred.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
two constitutional reforms since 2015. We've not had any of those suggested, and obviously there are nice up to date examples.
Yeah, it's very yeah, and I purposely put quite a big stretch in that, and there's a few that we could mention since 2015, but I've just kind of put two down. So I put down the Recall of MPs Act in 2015. So again, it shows the flexibility of the Constitution. It was partially in response to the expenses scandal. So MPs abusing their expenses, and then the argument that if we find an MP has broken the law or we don't want them in our constituency anymore, we have the right to recall them, which is good because it's not just through the party mechanism. It opens it up a little bit. And
We've
then,
had.
of course, oh, sorry. Oh,
I
yeah,
was say
yeah,
I've just popped on there from the Fixed Term Parliament Act, of course,
yeah,
um, was brought in. Actually, before that, wasn't it? 'Cause it was brought in.
yeah.
You missed a gap out. You missed an area out. We had 2010 to 2015, which you could have
I did
could have
actually.
included in there. So it was brought in because of the coalition, but it's an interesting one because of obviously no longer being in place, whereas most of the other ones we're talking about are constitutional reforms that have remained part of our constitution.
Yeah, exactly. Actually, yeah.
Mm,
So, but it is still important as a
yeah,
constitutional reform to show that maybe we do need a codified constitution because the reforms don't necessarily stick. They can be overturned by a simple act of parliament. So it's a really good one to use. And actually, I
yeah,
don't know why I left out that five
the 5
years. So
years. Well, why
nothing,
not?
nothing happened, you know.
Why not?
And
But yeah,
then, of
Brexit.
course,
But that Brexit
yeah.
thing, that was
That's a
that.
major
It
reform,
was
right?
huge,
And
wasn't it?
it's a big change. So withdrawal from the European Union. So it counts obviously as a treaty, which is one of the sources of our constitution, and has basically changed the political nature of the UK in that sense.
And lots of further implications for the constitution, aren't there? Like with regards to like the Northern Ireland Protocol
Yeah,
and the kind of changes to all the regulations. And as you say, this was there was there was an act for, so it was partly statute law and then also the various treaties involved. So yeah, very interesting from a constitutional point of view.
definitely.
Um, and then we had some nice
Oh,
suggestions. Oh, English votes for English laws has come in as
yeah.
well. That's another interesting one.
Yeah, and I
It's
haven't.
it,
I didn't not include the ones that have been removed. It
yeah,
just had, yeah, but they're important as well. I think
yeah,
that's an example of, it kind of fits even into the case of further reform in the sense that England's been left out of
mm,
devolution. So this was kind of put in to try to attempt to resolve that, but of course it absolutely failed, and they had to overturn it afterwards. So that
yeah.
is a really good example to show again the limits of the constitution.
Yeah, so cases for further reform. We've already had suggestions of maybe proportional representation, electoral reform, maybe an elected House of Lords. I don't know if that is that the one that you
Mm,
you said. Yeah,
yeah.
but yeah. dealing with the West Lothian question and the extent to which England is represented in this sort of newly more devolved UK is an interesting one. People still talk about the idea of possibly an English Parliament. What has been done, but of course it's kind of asymmetrical and only happens in parts of the country, is significant reform of local government, with particularly the mayors having these roles. London had devolution at quite an early stage, of course. Ciara can talk to us about that in a minute. As a maybe it's because she's a Londoner, but obviously, you know, from very early on, you had the Great London Authority. You know, it happened at the same time as the other devolutions. That's another 97 to 2010 reform. But part of that, perhaps controversially at the time, was the mayor, the directly elected mayor aspect of it, which has caught on around many other parts of the country, even initially with the metro mayors, but even rural areas now. North Yorkshire has a directly elected mayor for the first time, so even I'm sitting in a place with a directly elected mayor now, which is a change. And perhaps considering what a sort of big rural area it is with Rishi Sunak's constituency and other similar ones, perhaps surprising that it's a Labour directly elected mayor. But that's one for another discussion for another day. But you know, ultimately it's not devolution on the same scale as like Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. So there is still this case of does there need to be more English devolution?
Yeah, it's a big discussion. And yeah, so like you mentioned, the funding issues with Lothian question. So yeah, and that's definitely an argument for further reform. Devolution is just a really good topic to kind of know well because it fits into so many different aspects of constitutional debate and Parliament and Parliament's power as well. So that's a nice segue, actually. Thank you, Duncan, to outlining two arguments for devolution being a success. So, can you think of two ways that we can say devolution has worked really well? Beautiful. Ended the troubles of the Good Friday Agreement, 100%. Peace in Northern Ireland, a pretty big success, I would argue. Yeah.
Massive, yeah.
It's also an interesting one, actually. We look at the evolution in terms of the increased use of referendums under Tony Blair. So that's also quite good.
Yeah, and also increased use of, or the beginning of using different voting systems as well, electoral systems. So yeah, interesting aspects there. Increased turnout in general elections as a result of devolution. You might need to join the dots for me there, Joshua. I'm not saying you're wrong, but I just want to know why. If you could explain why one might have led to the other. Quiet and
Rebecca
calls for
said,
Scottish independence. That was an argument for
yeah,
doing it, wasn't it? We could argue that
yeah,
perhaps it didn't achieve that. That might be one for the other side, possibly, because of course we did have a referendum. People are still
and then
talking
they
about
took
it.
yeah, and they
So
took the government to court, didn't they, to say that we have the right for a second one. Not that that went very well for them, and they've been a
no,
bit busy since, haven't they?
that's true.
uh,
Incidentally,
yeah,
just
but
this will be surprising when people are watching this on catch up, but I've just had a news alert on my phone that people are very much thinking that while we're on air, we're probably going to hear that there's going to be a general election called for July the 4th. I'm not saying it's definitely happened, but that's
ooh,
sources close to the Prime Minister seem to be confirming that. But your exams will have finished, so that 2019 will still be the most recent general election, but that'll be fun for everyone. Anyway, sorry. Right. Yeah,
4th of
calls for
July,
independence.
interesting date.
That's an interesting one. Just following up to that one about quieting calls for Scottish independence. Calls for independence in Wales have risen from about 10% at the time of the referendum to 30% 2022. So that's interesting. That was definitely one of the arguments given. Yeah, it's improved representation for people in the devolved areas. Absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Would agree with that. Should we see what we've put? Some of these same points, I know.
Yeah, so
Peace in
peace of
Northern
Northern Ireland, and I think this is an interesting one to consider. Actually, none of the major parties support it being overturned, so it's on no manifesto to try and remove devolution. So it's kind of become a political consensus that it's been successful. So I think
And it
that's
didn't,
quite
yeah,
interesting.
and it didn't start as one, did it? It was reasonably controversial at the time. There were,
Yeah.
there were definitely politicians who opposed devolution, but there aren't really any now.
Joshua's justified his point very nicely. I love this point. Very detailed statistics as well, which is excellent. So in 2003, turnout in the Scottish general election was 49.7%, whereas in 2021 it increased to 63.5.
Excellent.
That's the same. There was similar trends we've seen with the Welsh Assembly, now Parliament as well. The referendum in favour of it was miserably
Really low turnout.
low, really low turnout, but that turnout has increased substantially since then. So people may not have bought into it initially, but it seems like they are buying into it and they like the idea of a regional body, even calling it a
Yeah,
parliament nowadays.
yeah,
So that's a good argument too.
yeah. Now you could just a little counter argument. It's always nice to have a counter argument. Is turnouts have increased since 2001 across the UK, haven't they? Not just in areas with devolution. They've increased in England as well, but possibly not to that extent. So it's definitely an interesting one to look at, and great to have the stats there.
Mm.
Yeah. Okay.
What about failures now? Can we think about any
And I've
criticisms
just realised you're
or
talking. Sorry, you're talking about the Scottish parliamentary elections rather than the UK general election. Which, yeah, okay, got you. Sorry, I'm just looking at the figures there. Yes, okay, that's really good. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, sorry,
Well,
Scottish the is
yeah,
the
parliamentary
local
elections.
election?
Yeah, there's the Scottish
Scottish parliamentary
parliamentary
election.
elections.
Sorry.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, not general election, the Scottish
No.
parliamentary.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, so I mean, we already had one for perhaps a failure. The fact that independent calls for independence in Wales have risen from 10% to 30% in 2022. So that's a failure in the sense that it could potentially lead to the breakup of the UK, which is quite a big criticism of devolution. Are there any other criticisms or evidence of failure? Yeah, and Mahir's got a great one about Northern Ireland. So there is some instability in Northern Ireland. Like they've only just come back together to form the assembly and start passing policies, which has been interesting because the protocol is that if the assembly is not sitting, if they're not able to form their government, then whatever passes in Britain passes automatically in Northern Ireland. And that's led to things like abortion being passed as well as equal marriage. So they didn't get their kind of vote on those things.
Oh, it's an interesting one. Since '98, there have been long periods of time when Northern Ireland has been, you know, without a without a devolved assembly for various reasons.
Mm,
And obviously, there are more complexities because of the troubles in the peace process in Northern Ireland than in Scotland or Wales. But it has had long periods of
definitely.
time where devolution hasn't been working. So that's quite an interesting one. Um, I just think another success, really, you could say, is that obviously since the original devolution, in all cases, there's been further devolution, which suggests that people liked devolution because then they've wanted more powers and wanted further
Yeah, very
devolution.
true.
But that's another strength. Any other criticisms? Should we see what you've got? England has been shortchanged. It's what we were talking about before, really, isn't it? The problem with England and low turnouts
Yeah,
with
definitely.
the metro
Yes,
mayors.
the Scottish MPs can vote on English laws, but not vice versa. So that is an interesting point. Okay, it does create a bit of a deficit. So yeah, I'm not going to go on about that. I nearly did. Sorry. And then interest, interest in metro mayors is low as well. So about roughly 29% turnout. So that's not very positive either. Like even the London mayoral election, which is probably one of the more successful examples of devolution, had a quite a low turnout too, and that's just passed.
Yeah. Um, Mahir's put about the Scottish voting to stay in the EU, which on its own isn't necessarily a failure of devolution, but it does show some of the potential problems with devolution, in that you had, the potential for constitutional crises, if you like, where, it led to further calls for independence, didn't it? That Scotland had voted in this way differently
Yeah, it's
from the rest of the
why
UK.
it's needed as well. It's a great example to show the stark differences between England and Scotland in that sense too. So yeah, that you can see the political differences between the two based off of the vote leave,
Yeah.
the result for the referendum. This is a good example.
Yeah, and I suppose another example for the constitutional problems that emerge as a result of devolution, or that could be associated with devolution, would be the Gender Recognition Act as well, with the Westminster government deciding to kind of override the devolved Parliament in Scotland's decision on that,
I think
which
that's
is
a
the
powerful example as well. Like, I think if you don't know, if you're not too confident about talking about the Gender Recognition Act that was passed by Scottish Parliament, it's worth looking into. It's definitely something you can use across any essay, really, even if it's, of course, but you can get a lot of bang for your buck with that one, I think. It's a good
yeah.
example.
Okay, just a little bit of Parliament now. Could you give me 3 ways that Parliament performs the function of scrutiny? So you can do it nice and generally, just what thing happens in Parliament that produces that leads to them doing some scrutiny, or you can give me some examples of them scrutinising, or a bit of both. Let's have 30 seconds. Let's see what you come up with. We've got PMQs, we've got select committees. Absolutely. Committees,
Vote bill.
Lords. E-petitions is a nice and interesting one. Voting on bills. Certainly debating bills and the public bill committees, because that's when they scrutinise the legislation. Yeah. Yeah, so as we're coming with some of these responses, we're getting this idea that there's sort of 2 main things that members of Parliament, whether that's in the Commons or Lords as well, might scrutinise, and that's what the government does, scrutinising the executive, and then also scrutinising legislation, and they do sort of both of these things. People are coming up with lots of nice, interesting ideas. I'll just share what I suggested, which you have spotted all of these, I think. The select committees, I think that was the first one that came up. Prime Minister's questions and other ministers' questions, and the role of the House of Lords in kind of revising legislation, but of course also the House of Commons through public bill committees and things does plenty of that too. We've got some interesting ones coming up there as well. Opposition days, absolutely. The opposition might well use its opposition day to scrutinise something that the government's been doing. Absolutely, Mahir, Lords delaying legislation, that would be part of scrutiny. So yeah, absolutely. If it's interesting to kind of separate out scrutiny from perhaps the representative role or the legislative role.
Yeah.
Although scrutinising legislation is definitely part of scrutiny, Parliament also has a clear legislative role of passing and creating new legislation. Liaison committee is a really good one as well. Yeah, absolutely. The
That's a great
liaison
one for
committee.
scrutiny. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Scrutinising the Prime Minister.
Yeah, I think what you said is quite important. It's like these are technically all scrutinizing the government, but it is important to kind of be able to differentiate between the different ways that Parliament performs its functions. And scrutiny is a very specific function, like the things that Duncan's put up on the screen and some of you have mentioned as well. But passing legislation is also a function of government. It's a separate one of Parliament. Oops, sorry, Parliament. No, it's a separate one. So it's good to try to be able to differentiate between them,
Yeah.
because then you can have a more focused essay with different criteria.
Yeah. So, although backbench rebellions may well include some scrutiny, it's also part of the legislative function. They're rebelling against some legislation in those or some proposed legislation in those situations. E-petitions I might normally link to representation. It's a way in which Parliament, particularly this is the kind of the idea that the backbench business committee would make use of would perhaps use the petition to have a debate or a discussion in Parliament. That might involve some scrutiny, absolutely, but it's also perhaps primarily about Parliament trying to be more connected to the public, and that would be perhaps more to do with representation, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's good as well as part of revision to try and think of, examples of where there's a select committee that has been successful and one where
Mm-hmm.
it's not been successful. So someone mentioned the liaison committee, that's perfect. So you could look at the fact that Boris Johnson ducked the liaison committee for so long, despite the fact that there was COVID and things like that, as an example of its failure. And so forth. So it's quite a good thing when we're thinking about our arguments. Do we have like a good example that supports the argument and an example that counters it, and then building
Yeah.
those resources?
Yeah, and you could almost use that Boris Johnson example on both sides of the argument, couldn't you? Because
Yeah.
the reason he wanted to not go is because if it's because it's effective and because it can really put
Mm.
the prime minister on the spot. The fact that he was able to avoid going shows its limitation.
Yeah, he did some weird Facebook Live thing just before it as well, like a Q&A thing, and it totally failed. But yeah, it was an interesting, very interesting time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, I mean, nice segue to Prime Minister. We're doing very well here. There's criticism like one of Parliament's functions is to be a check to power and check to power of something like the Prime Minister. So there's different arguments to suggest that the Prime Minister is too powerful, and there's arguments to suggest that they are presidential. So on your right there, you've got 8 different examples. Where could they fit under the category? So which one are talking about limited power? Which ones are saying they're too powerful? And you could just write the numbers if it's easier.
Yeah, yeah. So limited and then some numbers, powerful and then some numbers.
Very tense.
It is very tense. You don't have to do them all if you can do them one at a time or whatever. 60 seconds has gone very quickly there, hasn't it? I feel like
Did
people are about. Oh yeah, there are some coming through.
So Mahir, doing really well today, mentioned the limits of Prime Minister power with the defeat of May, the other issue of party loyalty. Brilliant, yeah. They're very fickle political parties. MPs obviously want to keep their jobs. It's a very weird job because essentially, if you don't win the election, you are just automatically fired. So they need to have a prime minister that's going to win them their seat, basically. So yeah, if they're not, the prime minister can't guarantee success, they will be removed. It happened to Boris Johnson. Happened to Liz Truss. It happened to Theresa May. It's happened the last few. Um, Mahir also mentioned powerful. So yeah, Blair and Thatcher only facing full defeats each in the Commons. They were able to really push through all of their legislation because of the tools at their disposal, having quite sizable majorities. So they were able to
Yeah.
kind of use the whips effectively to pressure MPs and turn them into lobby fodder. And punish dissenting MPs, but also the royal prerogative. So both of them declared war, although Blair did actually consult Parliament, so maybe that's a limit as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, these
JJD got that one too, and for patronage, the prime minister being able to hire allies. That's another example of them being too powerful. Yeah.
it's a very good example too, to hire allies and secure their dominance in cabinet as well. And then they owe their careers to them, so they're more likely to vote how they're supposed to.
Should we have a look? Should we have a look?
Yeah, let's
Yeah.
have a look. Yeah.
Let's sort them
Uh,
out.
and I think it was a good point was mentioned as well that the Blair and Thatcher only having full defeats, part of that was through the big majority, which happened through first past the post. So don't forget those kind of component one votes. it can sometimes feel like, oh, it's a given. Why would I say that? But actually, just justifying it using that will push your answers along a lot further.
Yeah, yeah. So
Yeah.
there we go. Is it a couple of ones where people have suggested differently from what we've got on there? Just so suggestion would Sunak being able to use the royal prerogative be an example of limited power? I mean, it's an example of a strong power for the prime minister because he can um, legally, not necessarily always politically, easily commit British troops or go to war without a vote in Parliament because of the royal prerogative.
Yeah, and I think it's a good example because for years we argued that it shifted back to Parliament and that Parliament was the one who's now making that decision. The Prime Minister is less powerful. But Sunak loves to provide us with examples that change what we think. So he decided, well, that's not why he did it,
No.
but he committed to military
Yeah.
action in Yemen and hasn't consulted Parliament
No.
since.
And it's an interesting one because Brown did discuss the idea of sort of formally changing that, and Parliament, having a constitutional reform that would mean that Parliament had to vote on all such things, but he didn't, and so obviously there is still that flexibility in the system.
Yeah.
And Mitty Kitty's given an example of that patronage, Rishi Sunak making David Cameron a lord and then being able to bring him into the cabinet as a result of that. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, it's very powerful to be able to select who your cabinet are. And he needed the alliances, he needed the connection. So that's exactly why he did it.
Yeah. Okay, and possibly the credibility. I think the idea that it's having some. There was perhaps a lack of big beasts in the cabinet, and so bringing in a former prime minister certainly provides you with a big beast. The body which has the power to make, revoke, and change laws is known as the monarchy, the executive, the judiciary, or the legislature. So these are just some nice general MCQs about UK government. So just put A, B, C, or D. So power make, revoke, and change laws is D. Absolutely, it is the
I like
legislature.
that. Oh, wait. Oh, wait. Please.
Yeah, absolutely. I waited for you. Okay. The body that runs the country and proposes laws is same options in a different order just to annoy us, but
Sorry.
so what do we reckon? Running the country, proposing new laws. Got the judiciary, the legislature, the executive, or the monarchy. Yeah, lots of people coming through with the executive. Absolutely. Okay. Which is essentially the government. The body that interprets and applies the law, upholding the rule of law in society. Because they're all in different orders again, I won't know which question you're answering necessarily because it is C, but you may well have still been answering the last one. But anyway, I think lots of people did come in with C for that one. Well done. What was the convention blocking the Lords from voting against manifesto pledges called? It might just be that I'm just fond of it always being the same answer.
Someone picked J. I'm not sure it was J.
I don't think we had a J as an option. Is it Parliament Act, Sainsbury's Act, Salisbury Convention, or the Parliament Convention? It is C again, Salisbury Convention. Well done. Could be the Sainsbury's Convention. That'd be fun.
We just
J for judiciary. J. Yes, okay.
Oh,
Got
okay.
you. Well done.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's a good idea.
And that did differentiate it from all the other C's. They're just all C, I think. Which of the following is not a form of parliamentary scrutiny? Let's just go to C. It's fine. Okay. I don't know what's happened there. I've obviously I didn't spot that when I was writing it. Okay. And how many days are backbenchers? How many days are backbenchers allowed to choose the topic of debate for a year? I give you a really, really good guess for that one. Based on the kind of pattern that's been emerging over the last few questions.
C is going to be right one day. Stephanie wrote the answer.
It is still C, yes. Well done, Stephanie, for writing 35 rather than just keeping on writing C again. Okay. Whew. Select committees have been argued to be A. Sorry, there's some typos on here. I'm trying to apologise for this. The only way to protect British democracy. B, a bit too selective. C, extremely effective, or D, toothless watchdogs? Obviously, there are lots of different debates about these, but which quote or whatever has been used about it? Yeah, well done. It is D. They have been described as toothless watchdogs, although it is fair to say that some people suggest that they are pretty effective at scrutiny. You can argue both ways, of course, as we need to if we have an essay about them.
Balance,
Yeah. Okay.
this is a good old-fashioned lineup. So there's going to be some clues, and you have to try to guess which prime minister is being talked about. I've tried to make them deliberately confusing, though. So there could be some that actually fit with either, or maybe multiple. So
Yeah.
let's have a good
So
think and see how
the
well
early, yeah, the early clues. It might be just a lucky guess if you get it from the early clues, but let's see.
exactly. Yeah. So I was eventually pressured to leave by my party. Was that
Oh,
Tony Blair, Theresa May, Margaret Thatcher, Boris Johnson?
you talked about that a bit before, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
JJD's suggesting it could be Thatcher.
True,
Could be
definitely
Thatcher.
true with Margaret Thatcher. She was
Could
definitely
be Thatcher.
pressured to go, wasn't she? Yeah.
Quite a few people
Anyone
thinking
else?
Thatcher.
Anyone else pressured to leave by their party? We had a little clue earlier as well, actually, about
Yeah.
the Johnson having the biggest cabinet resignations in post-war history. I think
Yeah,
could
that was
be
one of his
Tory.
limitations of the Prime Minister's power. Oh yeah, someone's suggesting it could be D, could be Boris
Do you still
Johnson.
have the clue? Let's see.
Absolutely could be.
Has
I
the
think it.
general election been confirmed? I just got a message.
Oh, it might have been. I'll have a look in a sec.
All right.
I had a strong command of the cabinet. That's not quite all of them now, is it? But it's
No,
it's
one has
most of them
100%
still.
fallen off. Who's it definitely not now? Yeah, it's definitely not appropriate for one of them. Thatcher, oh, she did for a long time have a strong command of her cabinet. I'd still say she did. It was more so the part, well, the cabinet did obviously lead the brigade, but yeah. Blair, he's very strong command of it. He had his
Yeah.
little sofa cabinet, didn't he, where he would make decisions outside the cabinet meetings by getting groups of people together.
Yeah.
Definitely not May. Yeah, Theresa May 100% did not have a strong command of her cabinet, so we know that we can eliminate her now. It's definitely not her. So it's going to be A, C, or D. Poor Theresa May. Number 3, I was only defeated in the House of Commons 4 times. Oh, wait, we can definitely get rid of someone now. So we've got 2 left.
We had
Who are
who
the 2?
these were earlier, didn't we?
Yeah.
Suggesting
So it could
JJD
be
saying Blair.
strong
Could-
command of cabinet ministers. Yeah.
Yeah. The 4 defeats, we had 2 people had those. Yeah. We've
Wonderful.
got that there.
Blair
Well
and
done.
both
Blair
had
and
4
Thatcher.
defeats. So it's going to be between the 2 of them. So let's see the last clue and see if this gets us anywhere closer. Oh, all of my defeats happened within 1 year. What a niche piece of knowledge.
It's unusual though, isn't it?
Yeah, so incredible to only suffer 4 defeats. They also suffered like over 300 defeats in the House of in the House of Lords. Sorry, this person, and it was Blair. No wonder he
Well
wanted
done.
to do Lords reform. So
Well
yeah,
done. Lots of good answers there. We're going to come back to the studio. So thanks very much for all your answers. Some really good ones. I apologise, there were a couple of typos on that MCQs. When we put the PowerPoint up on the Tutor website, and I'll make sure those have been those have been corrected before that goes up. But there we go. People are giving lots of examples and adding more on there.
oh yeah, someone mentioned the defeats for Tony Blair were because of anti-terrorism. That was a big failure.
Yeah, I mean Iraq. The main vote on that went although it was at the time it was the biggest backbench rebellion that there'd been, because the Conservatives voted in favour. In fact, it passed pretty comfortably, but a lot of things that happened subsequently, and it certainly gave Labour backbenchers a taste of rebellion, the Iraq vote, and then so there were some subsequent votes where they rebelled similarly. Okay, thank you very much. Guys, you can absolutely rewatch this anytime you like. Next week, which obviously is half term, but we will be doing a kind of warm up for paper 2. So do please come along with your questions and your any things you want clarification on in relation to paper 2. That can include questions about your non-core ideas. I won't do specific activities on those just because everyone does different ones, although there are 2 or 3 that are the most popular. I wouldn't want to just do feminism ones or just do nationalism ones and then people be upset that we weren't doing those. Oh, you're doing your AS, doing your final exam tomorrow, JJD. Well, good luck with that. Okay. And if you've got any more exams this week, all of you watching, good luck with those. We'll see you next time. And yeah, thanks very much. Cheers, guys. Thanks. And thanks very much, Ciara.
Thank you.